to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our monthly Studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Today, our co-hosts are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
and Jeff Drozda.
And we're going to be beginning a journey together in our Studium with all of our lay Dominican family here in Lafayette, Louisiana. And we're going to be beginning the Summa Theologiae, also called more properly, the Summa Theologiae by St. Thomas Aquinas. You've probably heard of, at least, Bible in a year, Catechism in a year, but don't look for a Summa in a year to be coming out anytime soon.
I think you totaled it up, it'd be a Summa in 100 years, something like that.
that would be one question a month. But I think even if you did one question a day, it's still going to take a couple of years. So at the bare minimum, and at that will be about average of 15 pages a day, which I don't think anybody's going to read out loud or sit for. So I don't think that's going to be coming out anytime soon from Ascension Press. But anyway.
Well, you never know. However, so the whole purpose is that, we don't want anyone to be overwhelmed, because when someone says, all right, let's read the Summa, and everyone gets petrified because it's a huge book, it can be complex, but the whole purpose is you can do it. And we want to walk you through it. We want you to walk through it with us. And so we have some reference materials that you can follow along. So as we go through the Summa, you can follow along with us. So we'll be, like Cheryl said, we'll be doing it once a month. And the best place to read the Summa for free online is going to newadvent.org/Summa. So that is newadvent.org/Summa. And there you can go and you have all the books broken down. And of course, we'll go into a little bit more detail on what those books are. But, for our purposes, we're going to spend the first part on the Prima Pars, which is the sacred doctrine. Now, before we get too deep into this, we want to just take a step back, and I know that we've talked about St. Thomas Aquinas in much more detail previously, but we just want to just kind of refresh your memory on who St. Thomas was. Obviously, he was a Dominican and probably one of the most influential writers in church history. St. Thomas was born January 25th, 1225. And what is amazing is that when he died on March 7th on 1274, he was about 48 or 49 years old. So those of you who are not yet 48 years old, you still have hope. If you're over 50, like those of us here talking to you today, then we have a lot of makeup to do. But the angelic doctor, and that's another name that St. Thomas Aquinas was called. He wrote numerous articles, books, and volumes. And so, sometimes when you see him depicted in an icon or a picture, you see St. Thomas with a sun on his chest, and sometimes you see him holding a book in one hand and then a church in the other hand. And so it kind of reflects, what he has done. I mean, writing for the church is something that we look at today. And, two popes specifically said that all seminarians must read St. Thomas, and it's part of the curriculum for those in seminary. And so when we take a step back and we say, well, okay, so why did St. Thomas write the Summa? So Cheryl, what would you like to add on why St. Thomas wrote the Summa, which is extremely voluminous, and but we're going to get through it together. So why did he write it?
The good thing is that St. Thomas said himself in the prologue why he wrote it, and he does it in a very concise way. He just basically says that there's a lot of confusion at that time in the different writings. Each one had a different purpose. They were sort of scattered. So in order to just focus on building the entire base of theology, beginning right at the beginning with, well, we're going to be talking about the first question here. The nature of sacred doctrine will be the first question. And then, does God exist? Of course, is the next question. So those are question 1 and 2. So basically, beginning literally at the beginning, he builds and builds and builds. And he goes and he does what they call exitus reditus, which is a going out and then coming back. So we begin and you go out from God, the very beginning, and then he talks about creation, and he goes into all that and goes into the virtues, and then he goes into and then it goes into, well, when we begin the virtues, you're going back to God. Now, so we begin with God and we go out and we talk about what he created, and then in humans, and then in how we are to respond once we know this, and coming back into, to come back to God, because our end is God. And that's going to be an important part of this first question. We'll get to that in a minute, but our ultimate end is God. And so in this, he builds the entire body of information, the height of all theology. And that, by the way, is the name of the book, Summa Theologiae. It means the height of the study of God.
So when we look at why St. Thomas, wrote this, we have to go back to, the 1260s and look at what was happening during that time period. And quite frankly, the Roman province of the Dominican order was not in a great shape. I mean, the intellectual status of the order at that time in that area was not very strong. They were not reading sacred books. Their preaching was, I guess, what you could call theologically not very exciting, and so there was a need to put that rigor, put that vigor back into the preaching and back into the teachings of the Catholic Church during this time. And so in 1265, the Dominican order said to St. Thomas, hey, you need to come up with something that's going to help reinvigorate the order, reinvigorate the Catholic Church. And they said, well, we'll have this center where you can teach, and all the Dominicans will come to this house of study, and you will teach them how to go back out into the society and as missionaries and preaching the Gospels across the country. But at that time, it was specifically the Roman province of the Dominican order, and so that was his job. So what he ended up doing was to creating a course of studies for his students, and it was basically a studium. And once again, this is what we do, studio to studium. And so he produced a textbook, and better known as the Summa today. And it's always kind of comical because in the introduction it says that this is for beginners. Well, in reality, it's beginners with a background. And so that's where we start off with in better understanding and learning more about the Summa. And keep in mind, St. Thomas Aquinas, this was not his only document that he wrote. If you look at what St. Thomas wrote over the years, he was writing 2, 3, 4, 5, either papers, documents, summas, there are other summas, all at the same time. So you have the Summa contra Gentiles, and this was in 1258 to 1264, and at the same time, he was writing his dissertation on kingship, or de regno. And just as a side note, for those of you who are looking for, what is a perfect government to be ruled by, pick up on Kingship by St. Thomas Aquinas, and you can find out exactly what he thought was the perfect government for the people. So I digress, but he had 2 or 3 secretaries with him at all times, and he was dictating to them simultaneously on various different documents, and it's absolutely incredible on the amount of work that he was able to produce, even commentaries on the Bible, the Gospels, the Psalms, Job, Isaiah, and even the Creed. So, with that background, I'll turn over back to Cheryl, because she took the Summa and spent 2 years of her life reading a question a day. So can you take people back to that, and why would you want to do this?
So about 8 years ago, I got the entire 8-volume set. So if you want to know how voluminous this work is, it's. I wish I knew how many pages. I don't have that on top of my head, but it is 8 very large volumes, very large books, and I put them on my shelf, and I'm like, how am I gonna do this? How am I gonna get all that in all what we used to say? How am I gonna get all that goodness in there? So anyway, I kept thinking, how am I going to do this? So I thought, if I do a question a day, I should give another little tip or background. I had just read a book called How to Read a Book by Adler. I can't think of his first name. Sorry.
Mortimer.
Thank you. Mortimer Adler. And it's an amazing book, but it frees you up to read great and challenging books without feeling like you have to know everything. You have to approach this book with humility and with the realization that you're not going to master it, not on your first reading. And this is what Adler did. He kind of freed me up to just almost rush through the book and get the whole picture. But so I thought, at that period of my life, I really just needed. I mean, there were some struggles going on, and I thought, I'm going to go to daily mass, and I'm going to set this project in front of me of reading one question a day, and it can occupy my mind because I wanted good stuff going in. And it began to occupy my heart after the 2 years. It really is. I know it's hard to believe, but that journey of reading through the Summa was a very moving part of my life, a time that really inspired me to do a lot of other things and to do better at my vocation and being a better Catholic. So that's how I decided to go about it. I did have a few days off. I will say that. So if you know the Summa, we're going to give you a little of the layout. There are 3 parts. I kind of gave a little bit of the layout a minute ago, but there are 3 parts. There's the Prima Pars, Prima Secundae, which is the second part, and then there's Secundae, which is the second part, and then there's the Tertia Pars, which is the third part. And each one addresses different things. As I mentioned before, this beginning part is beginning at the very beginning, and then it goes like building an entire understanding of God, basically, or how we can understand God. And then it goes into God's creation, and then we begin to come back to God through virtue, understanding also the opposite, which is vice and so forth, but focusing on virtue and then going up to the higher things, which are the sacraments, the things that help us, grace in the sacraments. And then, and as you might know, St. Thomas, he didn't finish the Summa. And we spoke about this before, but basically when he got to the end, or after, I think, 2 or 3 sacraments, he had a mystic vision of heaven and felt that everything he'd ever written fell short of that, of what he saw. And it was only 3 or 4 months after that he passed away into heaven. And
then that's when other folks took over, and that's called the Supplementum, if you're looking for that, for wrapping up the Summa. So once again, you're listening to Christ Our King Catholic Radio, and this is 90.5 FM, 99.5 FM, and 1230 AM. We are your Third Order Dominicans here in Lafayette, Louisiana, and the St. Albert the Great chapter. And we are discussing today St. Thomas Aquinas, and more specifically, we are diving into the Summa. And we're going to go through the question number 1. And once again, I just want to toss out that if you would like to follow along with us, please go to newadvent.org/Summa.
And one thing I just want to say about the supplementum that Jeff just talked about is that they didn't just write it from their own knowledge. They actually took other writings of St. Thomas and from, I believe, like the sentences he wrote on and some other things. And they brought that, they completed it the way they thought he would. So it wasn't just something kind of thrown together by somebody else.
That's right. Well, let's go ahead and look at question number 1. And if you might want to just go over a little bit on how it's structured and what's the best way to read the Summa.
I don't think there's a best way. I think you should dive in and just read it. We do discuss little tips that a lot of people in our group do it different ways. Sometimes, but it helped to just know the structure. When you begin, so in this one is question 1, you'll see that there are several articles. I call them sub-questions. They call them articles, but they're actually questions that fall under that question. And St. Thomas will take, for example, question 1 has 10 articles under it. Here, I'll just give you the example. Question 1 is on the nature of sacred doctrine. Each of the articles underneath ask a question. Article 1 says whether it is necessary. 2, whether it is a science. 3, whether it is one or many. 4, whether it is speculative or practical. 5, how it is compared with other sciences. 6, whether it is the same as wisdom. 7, whether God is its subject matter. 8, whether it is a matter of argument. 9, whether it rightly employs metaphors and similes. And 10, whether the sacred scripture of this doctrine may be expounded in different senses. So all of those articles are under question 1. So Article 1 asks whether, besides philosophy, any further doctrine is required. And how St. Thomas begins is with objections. He'll tell you, and these are not just straw men. He actually gives objections that he knows are out there to these questions, objections to the answers that he's going to give. But you don't get to know what he's going to answer until you get to a part where he says, I answer that. Or on the contrary. So let's give an example. Let's go forward to Article 5, whether sacred doctrine is nobler than other sciences. That's the question of Article 5 under question 1. You see their subsets. So I read, some people will go to how he answers. I go to the first objection, and here it says, it seems that sacred doctrine is not nobler than other sciences. For the nobility of a science depends on the certitude it establishes. But other sciences, the principles of which cannot be doubted, seem to be more certain than sacred doctrine. For its principles, namely articles of faith, can be doubted. Therefore, other sciences seem nobler. Now, I read the first objection. I know that that's not his stance. And then I read on the contrary. His on the contrary says, other sciences are called the handmaidens of this one. Wisdom sent her maids to invite to the tower. Proverbs 9:3. So now I know where he's going. I know what the objection ideas are, and I know that he's going to state that it is nobler than other sciences, you see. So I sort of have a framework to go from. Why I really chose this one is because the answer in this one is so excellent. He finally states in his long I answer section, he states, but the purpose of this science, insofar as it is practical, is eternal bliss. And I repeat, the purpose of this science is eternal bliss. So the reply to that objection I just read states, hence the fact that some happen to doubt about articles of faith is not due to the uncertain nature of the truths, but to the weakness of the human intelligence. Yet the slenderest knowledge that may be obtained of the highest things is more desirable than the most certain knowledge obtained of lesser things, as is said in Animalibus. Now, he does reference some things like this. That's from Aristotle, I believe, and sometimes you're going to get those references, and I just wouldn't worry too much about, especially if you're going through for the first time, I wouldn't worry about checking every reference and doing everything. Sometimes you get stuck in the references and dictionaries and trying to figure things out. You just, like Adler would say, read quickly through. You're going to find things that stick with you. And as you get to know how he writes, you're going to know more and more and understand more and more without referencing other people's thoughts and dictionaries and so forth.
So just keep swimming.
Just keep swimming.
Just keep swimming. So hopefully we haven't lost you, because I mean this is just the beginning, and it gets really very exciting. People do read the Summa different ways. I'll go ahead and read the article, and then I'll just kind of hop on down, and where he says I answer that. I read that, and then I go back. I look at objection 1, and then he says, the reply to objection 1. I read objection 2, and I see the response to objection 2. But it does not matter how you read it. It's just reading it. And I think you said that, Adler said that if you can just glean 40% of what you can, I mean, it's better than anything else. I mean, you are reading directly from the original source. You're not reading other commentaries. You are reading from the original source, and just gleaning a little bit of that, I think, is a huge success.
Part of the problem, sometimes I think people will try to reference something in the Summa. They'll look up maybe an area, and that's fine. It's good and it can be useful, but as it was written, it was a building up of things, and you really can understand it if you just keep swimming, like Jeff said, and getting through. Even if some days seem like a struggle, and I know I had some where I just felt like my brain was mush, but I just kept up the pace, and I really felt like at the end of it, like I said, it didn't just occupy my mind, and of course it did, but and it occupied my heart. It moved me tremendously in my faith and formation, because you can't love what you don't know, and to know more about God is to love God even more.
Well, and I think as we discuss further on on question 1, I mean, the articles are really structured to whereby you and I can walk away with a definite understanding. Now, there is some terminology that's a little bit different, and when St. Thomas says the philosopher, he's referring to
Aristotle.
And when he says the apostle,
he's referring to St. Paul.
He's referring to St. Paul. So just little nuances in that. But back to question 1, if you're able to follow along, talking about the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. Is it necessary? I mean, I think most people can walk away and say, well, yeah, it probably is necessary, but do you know why? And this is where I think he goes into much more detail on, is it necessary? And then the second article is it a science? Once again, during this time period, philosophy ruled the world, and people really believed that the philosophy came from all parts of the world. And St. Thomas was really unique in and looking at the different aspects of philosophy, and some of the writings have just been uncovered 100 years earlier. So when you bring in Plato, but especially Aristotle into Christianity, I mean that was kind of
also not just Aristotle, but one thing that was very edgy was the bringing in some of the Muslim philosophers. Averroes was one. I can't think of the other one off the top of my head. He because the Muslims had the documents of Aristotle for some time, and they were lost to the Western world. When they were recovered, there had been many commentaries, many changes, and some lost documents, unfortunately, writings of Aristotle, but a couple of the philosophers had really preserved some of it, and this is how, when it came back to St. Thomas, he didn't just throw out their thoughts. He considered the parts that were true and highlighted those and showed where there was a shadow, and cast a light in some areas that were false.
So, Article 2, whether sacred doctrine is a science. Spoiler alert, sacred doctrine is a science. And what is interesting is that he writes that, sacred doctrine is a science because it proceeds from the principles established by the light of a higher science. namely the science of God and the blessed. So, he really breaks down into specific nuances on where this comes from. Like we said, it's building blocks, building one on top of another, on top of another. And this is where he does such a phenomenal job. I saw a flow chart of just the first, I think it's the first either 3 or 4 questions in one of the editions. And the flow chart went off on 2 pages. And it helps you to follow it, but it just shows how systematic he was in moving forward. And
I just want to say to you, we're not professionals on this. We're not sort of trying to even set ourselves up as that. We're lay Dominicans, and as anyone, not just lay Dominicans, who wants to just know their faith better. Don't let someone say that you can't understand it or you need to read all the commentaries or whatever. And that's fine to read the commentaries. I'm not saying that that's bad. But so many people say, well, you're not qualified to do this. So I just want to kind of get rid of that myth, is that you can understand a lot. You give yourself more credit than that, and just give it a try. When I read this 8 years ago, read through the Summa, I wrote a little bit from each question that I got, and sometimes it was a really little bit. But on question, I wrote a little bit on question 1 and how I was surprised at how much I liked it. I was also surprised it didn't begin with, does God exist? But then I understood once I read it why, to consider this first. Before we study God, we have to, come to the fact that sacred doctrine and revelation of God and everything is actually something that you can study. So that's what he does in this. And he gets into, I think one of my favorite parts when I read this first was Article 10, which is the last article on the several senses of the Bible. He says, whether in Holy Scripture a word may have several senses. And if you've heard our show on typology, you'll know that the answer is yes. And we know, and St. Thomas knew that, hundreds of years ago, that Scripture was meant to have several senses, that when we say the right hand of God, we're not literally talking about his right hand. Therefore, it's got to mean something more. And that means it's just a way of showing God's power, right? So he really establishes this in Article 10 and talks about in detail about how St. Augustine he had, even hundreds of years before him, known that there were several senses of Scripture and that it should be taken in those several senses.
As we wrap this up, Cheryl, what would any takeaways from this first question? Anything that stands out that you'd like to share with folks?
So, like I said, there's so much beautiful to read in here. So many beautiful quotes. I think we talked about how the importance of this. I mean, the big word teleology, which simply means that our end is God. So we need to understand that end. I feel like that this question has some answers to that. Talks about why this is so important, why reading through it is so important, and why sacred doctrine is so important. And within that, sacred doctrine can be in multiple senses. In the spiritual sense, it reveals so many mysteries, but there is a literal sense as well. So this whole first section sets up the person for understanding the importance of the science of theology, and the height of theology is coming, and as we go through the book, and that's why, again, I said the Summa Theologiae is the name of the book.
And it is fitting that we wrap up our program now, and thank you so much for joining us, and have a great week.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death, and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the wind like a window pane. My soul's alright, but my body...